Ben sat in the cockpit of his fighter, his eyes scanning the dark, rocky terrain below. The battle had been fierce, and his ship was barely holding together. He had been shot down during a skirmish with the alien fleet, and now, stranded on this remote moon, he had no choice but to make the best of it. His hands worked quickly, trying to patch up the ship and make it functional enough to take off again. But something caught his eye, a movement in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. There, lying in the dirt, was an alien warrior. Her body was covered in armor that had clearly been damaged by enemy fire. She was struggling to move, dragging herself along the rocky surface. Her leg was bent at an awkward angle, blood pooling beneath her. Ben didn't hesitate. He jumped out of the cockpit and ran toward her, ignoring the pain in his ribs from the earlier crash. When he reached her, he crouched down, offering a hand. She looked up at him, her face a mix of confusion and anger. "I don't need your help, human," she spat, her voice full of defiance. Ben ignored her words and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "You don't have a choice. You're hurt. Let me help." She growled, but the pain in her eyes told him all he needed to know. Ben carefully helped her sit up, though she tried to push him away. Her anger only made her situation worse, but Ben didn't let that stop him. "I can't help you if you keep fighting me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're not going to survive out here alone." For a long moment she glared at him, her sharp alien eyes studying him as though deciding whether to trust him. Finally, she sighed, defeated, and allowed him to help her to her feet. The warrior was tall, much taller than Ben, with broad shoulders and a fierce presence. But right now, she was vulnerable, her strength drained by the wound in her leg. With his arm around her waist, Ben helped her walk to the shelter of a nearby rock formation. He set her down gently on the cold stone, taking a step back to assess her injuries. Her armor was damaged, but it was clear she had been in the fight of her life. Her leg was bleeding, a deep gash that would need immediate attention if she was to survive. "What's your name?" Ben asked, trying to break the silence. She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Talira," she finally said, her voice a low growl. Ben nodded, pulling out his emergency medical kit. "I'm Ben. I'm not going to leave." "You out here to die, Talira." Talira narrowed her eyes at him. "I don't need a human to save me." "You don't have a choice," Ben said, kneeling beside her and taking out bandages. "Let me help, and I'll leave you alone after that." She didn't respond, but remained still as he carefully cleaned the wound. He wasn't sure if it was her pride that kept her silent, or if she was just too exhausted to argue. But as he worked, he could see the fear behind her eyes. She knew her situation was bad, and deep down, she knew she needed help. Even if she refused to admit it. "Stay still," Ben said, his voice gentle as he wrapped the bandage around her leg. He was careful, trying to be as efficient as possible while giving her the respect she deserved. "I don't know how long. I'll be stuck here, but I'll get you out." Talira glanced up at him, her gaze softening for a brief second before she hardened again. "Why?" she asked, her voice full of suspicion. "Why would you help me?" Ben finished tying the bandage and sat back on his heels. "Because it's the right thing to do." Talira let out a bitter laugh. "You're all the same. People think you're doing the galaxy a favor by playing the hero." Ben's expression didn't change. "I'm not trying to be a hero. I'm just trying to get out of here alive, and I need your help to do that." Talira studied him for a moment, her eyes searching for some hidden agenda. But there was nothing there. Ben wasn't lying. He was here to survive, and that meant helping her, whether she liked it or not. The wind howled through the rocky landscape, the sound of the storm growing louder. Ben knew they wouldn't survive long out here if they didn't find shelter soon. The enemy would be looking for both of them, and he wasn't about to let Talira's pride get them killed. "I can carry you to the shelter," Ben said, standing up and offering his hand again. We'll figure out the rest later. Talira looked at him, the fire in her eyes still there, but this time she didn't push him away. Instead, she slowly allowed him to help her to her feet. Fine, she said, her voice flat. But you'll regret this, human. Ben smiled to himself as he supported her weight. I doubt that, Talira. They made their way to the shelter, moving slowly but steadily, Ben doing his best to keep her calm despite the danger surrounding them. As they settled into the shelter, the storm outside raged on, but inside there was a strange, uneasy calm. They had both survived, for now. But the question was, what would happen when the storm passed? The storm outside had grown worse, with the wind howling and rain pounding against the rocks. Ben and Talira sat in the shelter, the only warmth coming from the small fire he had managed to start. Talira was still not speaking much, but Ben had gotten used to her silence. Her eyes, however, often met his, full of questions she wouldn't ask. He didn't mind. He wasn't sure what to say either. The shelter wasn't much, just a small outcropping of rock that offered some protection from the storm, but it was enough to keep them safe for the night. Ben checked the status of his fighter again, hoping to get it running. It wasn't looking good. The damage was worse than he thought, and it seemed impossible that it would be flyable anytime soon. You're still alive, human, Talira said, her voice breaking the quiet. She sounded almost surprised, though she quickly masked it with her usual coldness. Why did you help me? Ben didn't look at her right away. He knew the question had been coming for a while now. I told you. It's the right thing to do. Talira scoffed, but this time there was no anger behind it. You humans are all the same. You talk like you have some sort of grand mission to fix the universe. Ben shook his head. No grand mission. Just trying to survive. And helping you gives me a better chance at that. You don't need me, she said, glancing away. I'm just a soldier. You could have left me. I couldn't, Ben said simply. You were hurt. And leaving someone to die, no matter who they are, isn't how I was raised. For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Talira's gaze was fixed on the flames, her face unreadable. Why are you still talking to me then? Talira finally asked, her voice low. You know who I am, don't you? Ben nodded, but his eyes stayed on the fire. You're a warrior. I can see that. But I don't care about your rank or where you come from. I care about getting out of here alive. She studied him for a long time, her sharp eyes flickering from his face to his hands, then back to the fire. You think we'll make it out? Ben wasn't sure, but he didn't want to show any doubt. We will. We have to. Talira was silent again, her mind seemingly far away. Ben let her be. He didn't need to push her to talk. She would speak when she was ready. He kept busy, checking his equipment and trying to make sense of his broken ship. As the night wore on, Talira seemed to drift in and out of sleep, her body clearly exhausted from the ordeal. Ben knew they couldn't stay here much longer. The storm would pass, but their enemies wouldn't be far behind. They would come looking for her, and when they did, he needed to be ready. The next morning, Ben woke to the sound of rain slowing down. The clouds still hung heavy in the sky, but the wind had died down, and there was a sense of quiet in the air. Talira had woken up before him, already sitting near the edge of the shelter and watching the skies. Ben stood up and stretched, his body sore from the crash and the cold. He grabbed his pack and pulled out the remaining food. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. Morning, he said, offering her some food. She took it without a word, chewing slowly. Her eyes never left the horizon, as if she were waiting for something or someone to appear. Ben sat down beside her, eating in silence. After a while, he spoke. We need to move. The storm's almost passed, but we can't stay here. Talira didn't look at him, but her voice was firm. I can walk now. Ben nodded. Good. I can't carry you forever. But we need to get to higher ground, away from the enemy patrols. I'll find a way to fix my ship, and we'll leave this moon. She didn't argue. She simply stood up, wincing as her legs shifted under her weight. Ben immediately moved to her side, but she waved him off. I'll manage, she said quietly, though her voice lacked the usual edge. There was no pride in her words now, just the simple truth of her situation. She was injured, but she wasn't helpless. They gathered what little they had and started walking. The terrain was difficult, filled with sharp rocks and uneven ground, but Talira pushed through it, determined not to show weakness. Ben stayed close, offering help when she needed it, but giving her space to move on her own. They walked for hours, the silence between them comfortable but heavy. Ben didn't know what Talira was thinking, but he had an idea. She had been trained to fight, to never show vulnerability. And now, here she was, walking beside a human, trusting him to keep her safe. He didn't know how long that would last. But for now, it was enough. By the time the sun began to set, they had reached a higher plateau, a place that offered a good view of the surrounding area. Ben set up a temporary camp, pulling out the last of his supplies. Talira sat a little further away, her back against a rock, staring into the distance. She didn't speak much, but Ben knew that she was processing everything. What had happened, what was happening, and what would come next. Ben sat down beside her, offering the last of his food. We'll make it out of here. Together. Talira took the food, her eyes still on the horizon. You really believe that, don't you? He smiled softly. I have to. For the first time, Talira gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. She didn't say anything, but Ben knew she understood. They were in this together now, and nothing would change that. The morning sun broke through the thick clouds, casting a pale light over the rugged landscape. Ben sat quietly by the fire, watching the glow spread across the land. Talira was still asleep, her body curled up in a tight ball near the edge of their camp. Despite her strength, the past days had drained her, and Ben knew she needed rest. He checked the sky again, searching for any signs of movement. The enemy patrols had been close, but so far they hadn't discovered them. Ben wasn't sure how much longer their luck would last. They needed to move again soon, but he wasn't sure how to go about it. His ship was still broken, and without a working ship, their only hope was to find a nearby settlement, though he wasn't sure where to start. As the fire crackled, Ben thought about their options. They could risk heading back toward the crashed fighter, but that might put them in the line of fire. If the enemy was close, their position would be compromised. But staying here in the open wasn't safe either. It was a tough choice, one he wasn't sure he was prepared to make. Talira stirred beside him, her sharp eyes blinking open. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just stared at him, as if taking in everything around them. Ben had grown, used to the silence between them, but there was something different now. Her gaze had softened, as though she were starting to understand something she hadn't before. We need to leave soon, Ben said quietly. I can't fix my ship without tools, and we don't have the time to wait for a miracle. Talira sat up slowly, her muscles stiff from the long rest. She didn't speak at first, her eyes scanning the landscape, as if searching for an answer in the distance. After a moment, she nodded. I know, she said, her voice low. We can't stay here, but we can't go back to your ship either. The patrols will be watching. They'll know where we are. Ben frowned. She was right. Going back was too risky, but they couldn't just wander aimlessly either. They needed a plan, something that would give them an advantage. We'll head east, Ben said, pointing toward the distant mountains. There's a chance we can find shelter there, maybe even a settlement. If we're lucky, we can find supplies and maybe a way to fix the ship. Talira didn't say anything at first, But she studied the path Ben pointed out. It wasn't an easy journey. The terrain was rough and the weather wasn't going to make it any easier. Still, there was no better option. The only choice they had was to move forward. Lead the way, she said simply. They packed up their camp quickly, each of them working in silence, their movements synchronized. Ben checked his pack again, ensuring he had everything they needed for the long trek ahead. His mind was still racing with thoughts of the enemy, but he knew they couldn't afford to waste time. They had to keep moving. The journey toward the mountains was slow and exhausting. The ground was uneven, and Ben had to be careful not to twist his ankle. Talira, despite her injuries, was moving with purpose, her determination evident in every step. She didn't show weakness, not even once. She had been trained to push through pain, and it was clear she wasn't going to stop now. Ben kept his eyes on the horizon, constantly searching for signs of danger. The landscape around them was quiet, almost too quiet. The wind had picked up again, and it felt as though they were being watched, though he could see no one. "Do you think they know where we are?" Ben asked quietly, glancing at Talira. She didn't respond right away. She seemed deep in thought, as though weighing her answer carefully. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady. "They know, but they don't know where we are exactly. The patrols are scattered and they'll be looking for us, but they won't expect us to go east. They'll think we're heading back toward your ship." "That's what I'm hoping," Ben said. "We have a chance, but we need to keep our distance from the patrols. If we're spotted, we're done." Talira nodded. "I'll keep watch." Ben was grateful for her skills, but he also knew the risks they were taking. They were deep in enemy territory now, and every step they took was a step closer to being caught. But for some reason, he wasn't as worried as he should have been. Maybe it was because he trusted Talira. Or maybe it was because he had no choice but to trust her. They kept moving for hours, the mountains growing closer with each step. The sun had begun to dip low in the sky, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. Ben could feel the weight of the day settling on his shoulders, but he pushed it aside. There was still work to be done. "We need to find shelter before nightfall," Ben said, glancing at Talira. "The weather won't hold up much longer." Talira didn't respond right away, but after a moment, she stopped walking and pointed to a narrow cave in the side of a cliff. It was small, but it would offer some protection from the elements. "That'll do," Ben said, relieved. "Let's go." They made their way toward the cave, each step carefully calculated. As they entered the dark opening, Ben felt a sense of relief wash over him. They were safe, for now. But he knew this wouldn't last. The enemy would be coming, and when they did, they would find them. The cave was small, but it offered enough space for them to rest. Ben pulled out what little food they had left and started a small fire. Talira sat near the back of the cave, her posture tense but controlled. Ben could sense she was still on edge, still watching, waiting for the inevitable. "You think we'll make it?" Ben asked, his voice quiet in the dark. Talira looked at him, her eyes sharp and focused. "We have to," she said simply. "We don't have a choice." Ben nodded. He didn't have an answer, but he knew she was right. They had no choice but to keep moving. They had no choice but to survive. The cave had provided shelter for the night, but as the first light of dawn broke through the entrance, Ben and Talira both knew the calm wouldn't last long. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, casting a faint warmth into the cold air. They hadn't said much during the night. They didn't need to. Each knew what was coming next. Ben packed their things quietly, checking the supplies. They still had a small amount of food and water, but it wouldn't last long. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only option. They had to keep moving. They had no choice but to hope they could reach the settlement on the far side of the mountains. Talira was already standing, her eyes scanning the entrance of the cave. She looked every bit the warrior she was, despite the exhaustion that showed in her posture. Ben admired her quiet strength. He had seen many strong fighters in his time, but none had her calm focus, the way she seemed to always be ready for. "Anything. Are we heading for the mountains?" Ben asked, his voice low as he finished tying his pack. "Yes," Talira replied, her tone steady. "It's the only way. We'll avoid the main patrols if we stay off the roads." Ben nodded and moved to the entrance, glancing out into the early morning mist. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks hidden by clouds. The air was still cold, and there was a sense of tension in the quiet that hung over them. He wasn't sure if it was the mountains that felt dangerous, or the thought of what might be waiting for them on the other side. "We'll need to be careful," Ben said, his voice firm. "The enemy's patrols are still out there. We can't let them catch us off guard." Talira nodded again, already moving with purpose. She didn't need to be reminded. She had already proven that she could handle herself. But Ben couldn't. Helped the feeling of unease creeping over him. They were in enemy territory now, and it wouldn't be long before the enemy found them. They set out from the cave, traveling cautiously. The rocky ground beneath their feet made the journey slow, and the terrain grew steeper the higher they climbed. The mountains were vast, and Ben knew the path would only get harder as they ascended. But this was the best chance they had to avoid the enemy. As they moved further up the mountain, the quiet of the landscape was interrupted only by the occasional sound of rocks shifting underfoot or the distant call of a bird. The sky above was a pale blue, but the wind had started to pick up, and the temperature dropped as the morning passed. The mountains were beautiful, but the beauty did little to comfort Ben. It only reminded him of the danger that lay ahead. After a few hours of climbing, they stopped for a brief rest. Ben sat on a rock, wiping the sweat from his brow, while Talira stood off to the side, watching the horizon. She was always alert, always looking for signs of movement. Ben appreciated that about her. He didn't have to worry when she was around. "We're getting close," Ben said, glancing at the peaks in the distance. "I can feel it. There's a settlement up there somewhere." Talira didn't respond immediately. She just continued to look out at the distant mountains, her eyes narrowing as if she could see more than what was visible to the naked eye. She had a way of sensing danger long before it arrived. Ben had learned to trust her instincts. "There's something wrong," Talira finally said, her voice low and careful. "I can feel it." Ben stood up immediately, his senses on high alert. "What do you mean?" "I'm not sure," Talira replied, her eyes scanning the surrounding area. "It's like the air is different. Like something's watching us." Ben felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The feeling of unease he had been suppressing returned with full force. They were too far into the mountains now. The open land was behind them, and there was no easy way out. Whatever was ahead, it was waiting for them. "Stay close," Ben said, his voice sharp. "We need to keep moving, but be ready for anything." Talira didn't need to be told twice. She moved silently beside him, her steps light but steady. They continued their journey up the mountain, each step more cautious than the last. The sound of the wind rushing through the trees was the only noise around them, but it felt like there was something else, something lurking just beyond their reach. As they climbed higher, the air became thinner, and the rocky ground gave way to more unstable terrain. They were close to the peak now, where the land was rugged and the slopes steeper. Ben knew they couldn't afford to slip, not with the enemy still on their tail. Then, as they rounded a corner, they stopped dead in their tracks. Ahead of them, hidden among the rocks, were several figures. Ben's heart skipped a beat. There were 3 of them, cloaked in dark clothing, their faces hidden behind masks. They were waiting. "Ambush," Talira whispered, her voice barely audible. "We've walked right into it." Ben cursed under his breath. They had been so focused on reaching the settlement, they had let their guard down. The enemy had set up a trap, and they had walked straight into it. Without warning, the figures moved toward them, their movements swift and silent. Ben's hand flew to the weapon at his side, but Talira was faster. She stepped in front of him, her eyes flashing with anger. Her hand moved to the hilt of her blade, and in one smooth motion, she drew it, the steel gleaming in the weak sunlight. The figures didn't hesitate. They moved in, their weapons raised. Ben's pulse quickened, and he stepped forward, ready to fight. He didn't know who these people were, but he wasn't going down without a fight. Talira's blade cut through the air with speed and precision. She was a blur of motion, blocking an incoming strike and countering with a fast strike of her own. The first figure staggered back, surprised by her strength, but he recovered quickly, his eyes narrowing behind his mask. Ben moved to help, but before he could react, one of the enemies turned and aimed a blaster directly at him. He ducked just in time, the blast missing him by inches. The air crackled as the energy from the shot hit the rocks beside him. "Get ready!" Ben shouted, his voice rising with adrenaline. "This isn't over." The fight in the mountains had been brief but intense. Talira's blade cut through the air, each strike precise and calculated, while Ben fought off the attackers as best as he could. The figures who had ambushed them were well trained, but Talira's skill was undeniable. She moved like a force of nature, taking on one enemy after another with fierce determination. Ben's heart pounded as he watched her, admiring her strength, but the danger was far from over. He had learned quickly that there was no such thing as a safe place. Not in these mountains, not in this galaxy. The hidden enemies were relentless, and they would not stop until they had what they wanted. Ben's mind raced, trying to understand who these people were. The cloaks and masks they wore told him little. They were skilled warriors, no doubt, but there was something else about them, something that didn't sit right. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he knew they weren't just ordinary soldiers. They were after something more than just a fight. "Stay close!" Talira shouted, her voice urgent as she parried another attack. "We need to keep moving!" Ben didn't need to be told twice. He reached for his weapon again, but Talira was already taking charge, her eyes scanning the terrain for an escape route. She wasn't just a fighter. She was a strategist. She understood the battlefield, the lay of the land, and how to survive when the odds were against them. Without a word, Talira grabbed Ben's arm and pulled him toward a narrow path that wound up the side of the mountain. Ben didn't hesitate. He followed her lead, trusting her instincts. The sound of footsteps behind them told him their attackers weren't far behind. They moved quickly, the narrow path forcing them to move single file. The rocks beneath their feet were loose and uneven, making each step more difficult. Ben's breath came in short gasps, but he pushed on. Talira's grip on his arm remained firm, guiding him along the treacherous trail. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small plateau, a flat space just big enough for them to catch their breath. Talira stopped, her eyes scanning the surrounding area. The enemies were still following them, but the path ahead was steep and narrow. It would be hard for anyone to follow them up here without being seen. "We need to make a stand," Talira said quietly, her voice calm despite the chaos. "We can't keep running forever." Ben nodded, his heart still racing. He was starting to understand Talira's strategy. She wasn't just trying to escape, she was thinking about their next move. And for the first time, Ben realized that she wasn't just surviving, she was planning to win. "We can't fight them all," Ben said, his voice low. "There's too many of them." Talira's eyes locked onto his, her expression steady and focused. "We don't have to fight them all. Just enough to buy us time." Ben was about to ask what she meant when a voice broke through the quiet. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, closer. "They're coming," Ben said, his heart sinking. Talira nodded, her face hardening with resolve. "Stay here," she said. "I'll draw them out." Before Ben could protest, Talira turned and vanished into the shadows, her movements swift and silent. Ben felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but he knew there was no time to argue. He had to trust her. He crouched low behind a large boulder, his eyes darting across the landscape, watching for any sign of the enemy. The minutes seemed to stretch, on endlessly as he waited, each second dragging on longer than the last. The air around him was still, but it was thick with the promise of danger. Then, just as he thought he couldn't wait any longer, Talira reappeared. She was moving fast, her silhouette barely visible against the rocky terrain. She darted from one cover to the next, leading the enemy in the wrong direction. Ben could see her pulling them away, but the question remained. For how long? He didn't have much time to think. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Ben could hear the distant calls of the enemy as they searched for her. He knew they would eventually realize the trick and turn back, but Talira's strategy had given him a window of opportunity. The question was, what would he do with it? Ben didn't have the luxury of thinking it through. He grabbed his weapon and moved toward the edge of the plateau. The enemy would be coming from the same narrow path they had just taken, and he needed to make sure they didn't have a clear shot at Talira. The first few figures appeared on the path, their cloaked forms moving in sync. Ben aimed carefully, his breath steady as he focused on the targets. The first figure went down with a shot to the leg. He didn't scream, but he fell, stumbling backward. Ben's pulse quickened as the others turned, surprised by the attack. He didn't hesitate. He fired again, hitting another enemy in the chest. The remaining figures scattered, taking cover, behind rocks and boulders. Ben's heart raced as he kept his position. He was outnumbered, but he wasn't out of options. He wasn't fighting for survival alone anymore. Talira's presence had reminded him of something. There was more to this than just running or hiding. They could win this if they played their cards right. From the corner of his eye, Ben saw Talira reappear, a shadow in the distance. She was moving with purpose, and he could tell she had a plan. The enemy was distracted, but it wouldn't last for long. They would regroup, and when they did, the fight would be even harder. Ben's thoughts raced as he reloaded his weapon. He couldn't afford to wait for the enemy to recover. This was their chance to end it. The next moments were a blur. Ben and Talira fought side by side, their movements synchronized as they worked together to push the enemy back. The rocky terrain made it difficult, but their strategy was simple. Keep moving, stay low, and never let the enemy take the high ground. Ben didn't know how long they fought, but when the last figure fell, the mountains were quiet once again. The fight was over. Talira stood still for a moment, her blade still in her hand. She wiped the blood from her face, her eyes scanning the area. Ben was exhausted, but he couldn't help but admire her. She had led them through the battle, and now they had won. "We've won for now," Talira said, her voice steady. "But we need to move again. The enemy will send more." Ben nodded, his body still shaking from the fight. "Where to next?" "Follow me," Talira said, her eyes gleaming. "We're not done yet. There's more to this than just survival." Ben followed her without hesitation. He didn't know where they were going next, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like they had a chance. The mountains stretched out ahead of them, their jagged peaks now bathed in the pale light of dusk. Ben and Talira moved carefully through the narrow path, each step a quiet reminder of the battle they had just fought. The enemy had retreated, for now, but Ben knew it wouldn't be long before they regrouped. Time was running out. The quiet that surrounded them was unsettling. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel beneath their boots and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Ben kept his eyes on the path ahead, but his thoughts were on what lay behind. The ambush had been too close. They had been lucky this time. "Do you think they'll come after us again?" Ben asked, his voice low as he glanced at Talira. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she continued walking, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. There was something about the way she moved that told Ben she was always thinking, always planning. She was the calm in the storm, and Ben was beginning to realize just how much he depended on her steady presence. "They'll come," Talira said finally, "but not right away. They're too careful. They'll want to make sure we don't slip away again." Ben nodded. He understood what she meant. The enemy would be smart enough to wait and regroup, maybe even send out scouts to track them. It would be only a matter of time before they were on the move again. They kept walking, moving deeper into the mountains. Ben could feel the weight of the journey on his shoulders. His muscles ached from the constant tension, and his mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. They had to keep moving, but the question remained, where to? As they rounded a corner, a sudden noise broke the silence. It was faint at first, just a soft echo in the distance, but as they walked further, the noise grew louder. It wasn't the usual sounds of the wilderness. It was something different. "Do you hear that?" Ben whispered, his senses on high alert. Talira paused, her sharp eyes scanning the surrounding area. "I hear it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Stay close." They moved quietly, keeping low to the ground as they followed the sound. It was coming from a small ravine ahead, hidden from the main path by thick trees and rocks. Ben's heart pounded in his chest as they neared the source of the noise. As they approached the edge of the ravine, they saw movement. At first, it was just a figure, a person, or what appeared to be one, moving between the rocks. But as they got closer, the figure stepped into view, and Ben froze. The figure was a woman, though unlike any human he had ever seen. She was tall, with dark skin and piercing eyes that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly glow. Her hair was long and braided, and her clothes were simple but functional, made from materials Ben didn't recognize. She didn't seem surprised to see them. In fact, she seemed almost relieved. "You shouldn't be here," the woman said, her voice calm but firm. "This is a dangerous place." Talira stepped forward, her hand resting on the hilt of her blade. "Who are you?" she asked, her tone cautious but not unfriendly. "And what do you want?" The woman smiled, though there was little warmth in the gesture. "My name is Asha," she said, "and I could ask you the same question. But I think we both know why you're here." Ben felt a shiver run down his spine. Asha's words were cryptic, and her presence seemed to carry a weight that Ben couldn't ignore. She wasn't just an ordinary person. There was something different about her, something that made him feel uneasy. "We're looking for a way out," Ben said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We've been attacked, and we need to find a place of refuge. Can you help us?" Asha studied him for a moment, her eyes sharp and calculating. Then she nodded slowly. "You're running from the enemy," she said. "I've been watching. I know who you are." Ben frowned. "What do you mean?" "I've been tracking the enemy," Asha explained, her voice low. "They've been after me for weeks, and they'll be after you soon enough." Ben's heart sank. He had hoped for a break, a chance to regroup and plan their next move, but now it seemed like they were only stepping deeper into danger. "What do you want from us?" Talira asked. Her eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Why are you helping us?" Asha took a step closer, her gaze never leaving Talira. "I'm not helping you," she said. "I'm offering you a chance to survive. If you want to live, you'll need to listen." Ben felt a pang of frustration. He had no time for games. They were running out of options, and every second counted. "We don't have time for this," he said, his voice tight. "We need to get moving. The enemy is closing in." Asha's expression softened, but there was still an edge to her words. "If you think you can outrun them, you're wrong," she said. "They know you're here, and they'll come for you. But I can help you, if you're willing to listen." Talira exchanged a glance with Ben, her face unreadable. Ben didn't know what to think. Asha wasn't like anyone they had met before. But her words made sense. They couldn't keep running forever. They needed to face the enemy. or they would be hunted down one by one. "We'll listen," Talira said finally, her voice steady. "But we don't trust you yet. Prove that you can help us." Asha nodded, as if she had expected that answer. "I can give you something the enemy doesn't have. Knowledge, a way to move without being detected. But you have to trust me. If you do, you might just make it out of here alive." Ben didn't like the idea of trusting a stranger, especially one who seemed to know so much about them, but he knew Talira's judgment was sharp, and if she was willing to listen, then maybe they had no choice but to follow her lead. "Lead the way," Ben said, his voice firm. "We don't have much time." Asha turned and gestured for them to follow. "This way," she said, moving swiftly between the rocks. "We'll start your training. You'll need to learn how to move like a shadow." Ben and Talira exchanged one last look before following her. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a while, Ben felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe Asha was the ally they needed to survive. The air was thick with tension as Matt and Talira followed Asha through the narrow passageway. The dim light from their small torches barely cut through the darkness, and every step seemed to echo loudly in the quiet. They were no longer in the wide-open spaces of the forest or the stone chambers they had encountered earlier. This place was different, smaller, more confined. It felt like a maze, each turn leading them deeper into the unknown. Asha moved ahead with confident steps, her eyes scanning the path before them as if she had walked this way 100 times before. Matt and Talira kept close, the weight of the journey pressing down on them. They had come so far, faced so many dangers, and now they were at the edge of something bigger, something that could change everything. After what felt like hours, Asha finally stopped in front of a large stone door. The door was smooth and featureless, but it radiated an energy that Matt could feel deep in his bones. It was the kind of energy that made the air feel electric, like something powerful lay just beyond it. "This is it," Asha said quietly, her voice serious. "The final test. If you want to leave this place, if you want to survive, you must face it." Matt felt his heart race. He had expected more challenges, more battles. But this was different. This wasn't about strength or survival anymore. This was about something deeper, something that could change everything. "What is this place?" Talira asked, her voice cautious. "What lies behind that door?" Asha turned to face them, her expression unreadable. "Behind this door lies the truth about what you're fighting for, the truth about your place in all of this." Matt frowned, his mind racing. "The truth about what?" Asha's eyes softened for a moment, and she placed a hand on the door. "The truth about the enemy, the truth about the galaxy, and the truth about what's really at stake here." There was a pause, and for the first time, Matt felt the weight of their journey press down on him. They had been running from the enemy, facing challenges they didn't fully understand, but now it seemed like the answers were within their grasp. The truth, whatever it was waiting behind that door. "I've seen what you're capable of," Asha continued. "But to move forward, you must face this test. It's not about strength or skill. It's about your will, your ability to make a choice." She stepped aside and gestured toward the door. "Go ahead. The door will only open if you are ready to face what lies beyond. The decision is yours." Matt looked at Talira, who met his gaze with a quiet nod. She didn't speak, but he could see the same determination in her eyes. They had been through so much together, and now they had to face whatever this was. There was no turning back. With a deep breath, Matt stepped forward. The moment his hand touched the door, it began to glow softly. The stone surface shifted beneath his fingers, and the air around them hummed with energy. The door opened slowly, revealing a large chamber bathed in a strange golden light. Inside, the chamber was empty except for a single pedestal at the center. Upon the pedestal lay a glowing crystal, its surface shimmering with a light that seemed to pulse with life. Matt felt an overwhelming sense of power coming from the crystal. But there was something else, too. A sense of danger, of something ancient and powerful that had been hidden away for a long time. He stepped into the chamber, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The crystal seemed to call to him, its light growing brighter with each step he took. He could feel the pull of it, the urge to reach out and touch it. But something held him back. He didn't know what this was, but he knew it wasn't as simple as just taking the crystal. As he approached the pedestal, a voice echoed in the chamber. It was not Asha's voice, nor anyone he had heard before. It was deep, ancient, and filled with authority. "You have reached the final test," the voice said, its tone resonating in the air. "To claim the power of the crystal is to make a choice. Will you use it for good, or will you let it consume you?" Matt's heart pounded as the voice continued. "You must decide. The crystal holds power, but with that power comes great responsibility. Once you take it, there is no turning back." He looked at Talira, who had followed him into the chamber. She was watching him closely, her expression serious. It was clear she didn't fully understand what was happening, but she trusted him. They had been through so much together. And now, the final choice was his. The crystal on the pedestal seemed to glow brighter, its light filling the chamber. It was calling to him, tempting him. But Matt knew that the crystal wasn't just a tool. It was a weapon, a force that could change everything, and the consequences of using it were unknown. "The galaxy is at war," the voice continued, its presence pressing in on him. "The enemy you fight is part of something much larger. The crystal holds the power to change the course of this war, but it can also destroy everything you know. The choice is yours." Matt's hand hovered over the crystal, the weight of the decision heavy on his mind. He could take it. He could use its power to defeat the enemy, to end the war once and for all. But what would it cost? Would he be able to control it? Or would it consume him, just as the voice had warned? He glanced at Talira once more. She gave him a small, understanding nod. It was his decision. Whatever path he chose, she would be by his side. But she, too, would face the consequences of that choice. With a deep breath, Matt stepped back from the pedestal. He turned to face the door, feeling the weight of the decision settle in his chest. "I can't do it," he said quietly. "Not like this." The voice in the chamber grew silent, and the light from the crystal began to fade. Matt turned to Talira, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I've made my choice," he said, his voice firm. "I won't let power control me. I won't let it control us." Talira stepped forward, her eyes filled with pride and understanding. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll fight this war the right way," she said. "Together."